Is war inevitable? If it is, then the only rational course of action for every nation to protect its people is to devise the most effective methods possible to ensure winning at war. But if war is not inevitable, then because it is so catastrophic, not only for the participants, but for the entire global community, it only makes sense to devise every possible method to avoid war. I've asked experts in the sciences, humanities, religion, and politics what they've learned about war, to find out if those who work for permanent peace are doomed to failure, or if the end of war is something human beings can actually achieve.
I want to write a book called Why Men Kill and Why Women Let Them, and work out why men fight and kill each other. And it really stems, I think, from hormonal receptors in the brain, for sure, compared to women. I think that also our killing instinct goes back to when we were troglodytes and lived in caves, and that why did we mate with powerful alpha males? Well, it was so that they could go and kill the saber-toothed tigers or marauding tribes as we breastfed our babies in the cave. So I think there's a socio-biological aspect to us, and I think, in fact, if you really ask me what I think, I'd say we're an evolutionary aberrant, and I don't think we're going to make it. And I once asked Carl Sagan if he thought there was any other life in the universe, and he paused for a long time. And he said, no, I don't think so. And I said, why? And he said, because if other species had reached the stage of evolution that we'd reached, they would have destroyed themselves. I think at the moment war is inevitable, and I think even if I write my book, which is going to be very provocative, Why Men Kill and Why Women Let Them, it will provoke a huge amount of debate and discussion, like the Occupy movement has on the 1% and the 99%, which is very healthy. And I think we must start debating this. Even then, is war inevitable? Look, I really wish it wasn't, but at the moment it clearly is.
Our closest relatives, the chimpanzees and bonobos, the chimpanzees clearly have territorial conflict. I'm not sure we want to call it warfare, but it's clear. I think it's related to warfare. And bonobos don't seem to have that. They do have territorial conflicts, like many primates do, but they don't try to kill the others, and actually the conflicts are quite mild, and they tend to mingle at the end. And so the bonobos are not considered warrior species. The humans have territorial conflict. We think that we mainly have it since the agricultural revolution, when we settled down and had possessions and had land which needed to be defended and all of that. More so then than in the earlier days when we were nomadic and hunter-gatherers. So the thinking is that humans started doing this more with the change in lifestyle. Although personally, we don't have evidence for that, but personally I think humans have also probably been doing it before, because you cannot just from one day to the next suddenly engage in warfare, whereas you never did anything like it before. That seems such a strange proposition to me. So I do think that humans probably did it on a small scale earlier, but we also have evidence from genetic studies that the human density was probably extremely low during certain parts of our history. There's some mitochondrial DNA studies that have even proposed that at some point there were maybe only a couple of thousand humans in the whole world. And if that's the case, and the whole world at the time meant Africa, and if that's the case, that there were only a couple of thousand, you cannot really imagine that warfare was a major business if the density of the population is so extremely low. So for humans, that's an open question: is how long have we been doing this? For sure, we have been doing this in the last 15,000 years on a large scale, and we probably have been doing it on a smaller scale before. I'm interested in both the good, the bad, and the ugly, so to speak, of the human species. And in most of the literature, there's always emphasis on the negative side. And so when humans engage in warfare or kill each other or commit genocide, we say, well, that's our animal nature speaking, and as soon as we do good things or we get along and we are productive and all of that, then that we immediately claim that as something that we basically invented, something that we came up with. And I'm very opposed to that kind of view, in the sense that I think also these positive tendencies and these capacities that we have to overcome conflict, they are part of our primate heritage, and some of that you can see in other primates.
You say then that human war is a kind of aberration of the social checks and balances that ape primates use to keep order?
Well, the primates, these two things need to be kept very separate. What primates do within their groups, which is keeping order and things like that, is something else than warfare. So warfare is usually an intergroup, so it's directed towards the outgroup. And so many primates have conflicts with their groups. So many monkeys, for example, they have territories, and when they meet the neighbors, they're going to be screaming and yelling at each other. They usually don't kill each other, but they defend their boundary. And so that kind of behavior is actually quite normal, territorial behavior in the animal kingdom. And in that sense, what humans do is nothing strange. What we do on top of that is maybe an aberration where we go in and massively kill the neighbors. That's an aberration. That's something that we don't see much in the primates, this kind of massive killing. And that's where the chimpanzees come in, who do some of that. And where totally different animals, such as ants, come in. If you want to see warfare, you go to the ants, and you will see tons of it. Because they have soldier ants, and we call them soldier ants. We have given them that label because they go into the territory of others and they cut them up into small pieces. And so there are animals who do this. But humans, I'm personally not convinced that we are made for this, so to speak. That's what people sometimes say. We have war in our DNA, which would mean that usually things that you are made for by nature are things that you do with joy and happiness. You know, you would eat and you have sex, and those are the things that you are made for and you take pleasure in, and there's no one who takes much pleasure in killing except for maybe that very small percentage of people who have no trouble with it. But I don't think human warfare is something we do joyfully or eagerly and so on.
From the point of view of biology, could you make the argument that war is or is not inevitable?
I'm not sure it's inevitable, in the sense that we tend to wage war. I do think that if resources are unevenly distributed, so let's say one country is starving and the other country is extremely wealthy next doors. When resources are unevenly distributed, you're asking for conflict. Now that conflict doesn't need to be translated into warfare. For example, between the U.S. and Mexico, it's translated into immigration. So it doesn't need to be translating into warfare, but that's one of the possible outcomes if you get unevenly distributed resources. And the world is getting overcrowded and the resources are limited. And so that's something to keep in mind, is that unequally distributed resources, they ask for some sort of resolution. And conflict is one of the possibilities. Sharing of the resources is another possibility. And so this is also true for the primates. When you provide primates with an attractive resource that they can potentially fight over, they may fight, but they may also share, or they may avoid conflict. There's many ways of handling that situation. But if you ask if war is inevitable, that would be my answer, is that there are certain conditions that invite certain resolutions.
I don't think war is inevitable. War can be prevented. We've learned that lesson in South Africa. Everybody believed that a civil war, full-scale civil war, was inevitable. The ANC moved from targeting military targets towards also targeting civilians. We imposed a state of emergency. Thousands of people were imprisoned without trial. Everything was moving towards a full-scale conflict, and we prevented it. Once people sort of hide themselves in their own corners and demand that all concessions must come from one side, then you get stagnation. Leadership requires, to my mind, taking initiatives. We have learned in South Africa that when you engage with what you would call the enemy, you need to sit across the table and in negotiation, you need to ask yourself and put yourself into the position of your opponent and understand also your opponent's case. And if your opponent does the same with regard to you, it is only then that you lay the foundations to start to build trust and to say, well, how can we avoid a catastrophe?
Well, nothing human, socially, psychologically, is fully determined, forever, permanent, inevitable in that sense. We don't know enough to forecast the future and say in the longer run what's possible or not possible. From the history we know of, and I'm speaking now not of prehistory, but of history, the last 4,000 or 5,000 years, then I would have to say that without marked change in our overall international organization and attitudes and institutions, yes, wars will follow as they have for all this time. Not everywhere. There have been periods of peace, intervals, regions of peace for long periods, and yet somewhere in the world wars are going on, nearly always. Is change of a sort that would end that possible? Certainly, no one can prove it's impossible. I choose to act, and many others do, as if it were possible. And no one can say definitely that we're wrong, and I find that a better gamble to make than to decide that there's nothing we can do about it.
I don't think war is inevitable. I mean, it's we never. Why, in the past we lived with a system of slavery, for example. 50 years ago, Rosa Parks could not, ride the front of the bus. 50 years later, you have Barack Obama, a black American. So, I mean, we have the power to change things. The power of ideas. It's a power of understanding. The power of understanding that as human beings we have to continue to refine our values. So the idea that war is inevitable, that we have to, the only way to solve our differences is through killing each other, is obviously something obscene almost. And but we have to find other ways. We have to develop a better system of security that can enable us to resolve our differences through dialogue, through talking to each other, through building trust. It's all about building trust. But and continue to stop talking about axis of evil and us versus them and all this sort of stuff, which does not help in any way resolving any issue, as we have seen. And that, of course, requires a lot of work by everybody. Require that you build completely re-engineer the whole global security system, including the United Nations Security Council I mentioned yesterday. Is a council is in many ways dysfunctional, and does not represent the 21st century. You need a system where everybody feel that they are a system of security that is global, that is inclusive, and people can trust that they will be protected.
2 years ago, at a Senate hearing, Admiral Blair, when asked at the Senate hearing what he thought was the biggest threat to US national security, everybody expected him to say international terrorism or nuclear weapons. He didn't say that. He said the biggest threat the US national security is the weakening of national systems in the face of ongoing crisis. This is a real threat today. You see, in what we call the age of austerity, countries balancing the budgets, limiting welfare, saving on the expense side, the effects you can see. Violent riots in London last week, what we have seen in Greece, in the banlieues of France, the food riots 2 years ago, when in more than 30 countries, people went to the street against their government to protest food shortages, protest for food security. At this moment, food security became a security issue. And this was an instance when the world turned to the United Nations and requested a response, a global comprehensive response, seek right now. And it was the first time that at a special session of the ECOSOC, of the Economic and Social Council, dealing with this food security, the President of the Security Council participated, clearly indicating that food security had become a security issue. And this is what it is. If you weaken a system so much that people cannot take it anymore, before people starve, people who are hungry, and they are faced with starvation, what are they doing? They either migrate, or they raise in protest or revolution, or they die. These are the three options. None of them are desirable. And once these developments go beyond a certain scale, they become uncontrollable. And they really weaken national institutions to a point where states crumble and lose their resilience. And this is a real threat to the world. We have to be conscious of that. And I think we would all should be well aware that what we call development assistance is not about giving alms or keeping somebody happy far away or keeping ourselves content and happy in the evening that we have done a little. No. This is an investment into a shared world, into our shared future. And this is in our interest. And unless we understand that, we will not make the progress.
The connection that I've been looking at is, what is the condition of women in indigenous cultures where there is a balance between the authority of men and women and the frequency of war? Is there a connection there? And I think there very clearly is. My work is looking at the Haudenosaunee, the Six Nations of what white people came in and termed the Iroquois Confederacy. Those Six Nations really built their whole confederacy on the foundation of peace. That concept of peace, that ability to maintain peace, really requires, I think, that women have an equal, and equal doesn't really work as the right term, because equality is something that we talk about in the absence of it. When you have a culture that is in harmony, is in balance, that there are voices that have equal authority, that have a similar authority, and neither one is higher than the other. When you have a culture in which no one rises above anyone else, and the good of the culture is really everyone's concern, not just in this moment, but the chiefs, the Haudenosaunee chiefs' responsibility is to make decisions for the seventh generation. Now, when you have that balance, different groups may have different responsibilities. And among the Haudenosaunee, the women have the responsibility for decisions of war. And I think the logic is that women give birth. Women are the ones who create those who would go to war. So women have the responsibility for choosing whether those that they have given life to will surrender their lives or will offer their lives, and under what conditions. But I think that idea that, where does violence come from against women is a really key, and children, is a real key to unpacking where does war come from? and what's war a result of? And when you have the Haudenosaunee Confederacy based on peace that had a track record of maintaining peace among these 5 nations until white people came and threw that all out of kilter, and when you have a culture that also has women in a position of equal authority with men in every part of their lives, I think you've created the conditions for peace. I think that creating the conditions of peace is to create conditions where it is in the interest of everyone to avoid war. And those conditions don't currently exist. It is in the interest of corporations to create war. It is in the interest of incumbent government officials to create war. And until we eliminate those incentives for war, I don't think we can end it. War is not inevitable. And how can I say that with such authority? I think living in the land where, on this land where we are right now, Haudenosaunee territory, people who were engaging in a constant, brutal warfare with each other, found the conditions and created the conditions for peace among themselves. Peace is not a vision of the unthinkable. Peace is doable. Creating the conditions for it is a doable task. Now, I'm back to Belva Lockwood in the Universal Peace Union, who said if every nation on earth agreed to mandatory binding arbitration, war would be a thing of the past. It would be taken off the table as an option. And it's hard for us in a Western tradition to even think that would be possible, because in our tradition we haven't seen it, but we have neighbors, my friends at the Onondaga Nation who are 15 minutes away from here, who know that war is not inevitable because they've lived it. And they live in a culture that lives in the legacy of that.
Absolutely not. In fact, I would say the opposite. That, I think that war is, a creation that historically sometimes has come to be defined as inevitable. Nations defining causes as to why there has to be war and so forth. But war for me is a space where we engage in violence. It's a space where we are trying to prove that we are more powerful than others. And I have just spoken about, combat and, colonialism and under slavery and so forth, where situations of war and so on created a condition where people had to fight back in order to liberate themselves and so on. But I think that even within those situations, if we look at today and historical movement that is teaching us that discussion and dialogue can lead to better options than war, I think we can argue that war, there is no way you can rationalize that war is inevitable. And we have seen situations where there was a possibility of war, but it was avoided through dialogue. And following how far we have moved in terms of making connections, in terms of linkages, in terms of platforms for discussion and so on, I think history has moved us beyond a point where we need to see war as a solution. And no war should be excused or should be excusable anyway. When you look at the destruction that is actually wrought by war and how much time it takes to even recover, and some aspects of life you can't even begin to recover in terms of devastating, the environment, people, infrastructure and so on. Is it really worth it, you know? And we have not given dialogue and discussion, you know, much of a chance, I would really argue, you know. So no, I'm utterly opposed to war, you know, at this point in human historical development.
War is avoidable. We have now over 50 years of peace in the whole big realm of the European Union, and even going to the United States, Canada, Mexico, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, in the whole OECD, we do not have any war between these nations in the last 60 years. The religions are very ambivalent human phenomena, no doubt about that. I say this as a religious person. And religions can work in two ways. They can incite hatred, war, and all bad things in the world. But on the other hand, religions can also provoke peace, inspire people to make peace. So you see, everything depends on the attitude of the persons, especially, of course, of the leaders, but also of the common people, how they use religion. You can abuse also music in both in bad ways, but you can use music in a good way. Why should we not make use of the religions to strengthen peace, to promote peace, and not to legitimize and to inspire wars? In all religions, especially in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the three monotheistic prophetic religions, you have people who think you have just to be convinced that only your religion is really the right religion. But I think more and more people understand that this is the wrong attitude. And I participated myself in the United Nations General Assembly in the 2 days, which were unfortunately not reported in the US press, about the dialogue of civilizations. And that was, as a matter of fact, the opposite of the clash of civilization. And there was not one delegation who spoke up who was against the dialogue. I think especially after September 11th, and that was at the United Nations building in Manhattan, after September 11th, I was down there in Ground Zero before. After September 11th, everybody sees that it is very dangerous just to provoke hatred, and I think we have just to do everything to commit the religious people to work for peace. We have tremendous forces and I think also very good examples where religious leaders have mediated. Think of South Africa, Archbishop Tutu, Pius Nodé, think of Poland, think of Latin America. Also popes have done many good things, I believe, in this matter. So why should we not use these resources?
I would want to speak as it were from the perspective of God. Now that really sounds an arrogance. But yes, I will do that and say, from what we have been able to garner of God's intentions, that is not how God intended it to be. When you look at that first picture in Genesis, it speaks about a primordial harmony. I mean, it speaks of it in poetic ways, that the lamb and the lion lie down together, and that Adam and the animals and everything all are in harmony, and that it was our abuse of our freedom that spoiled the picture, and that as it were, ever since the history of our world is a search for that harmony that was. And there are many times when you and I get to experience those moments when we say, why can't it always be like this? Last year in South Africa, we were host to the World Cup, and if you visited South Africa at that time, you would have really been thrilled to see just how South Africans of all races had this incredible pride in their country, and it seemed like there were no problems. And now we look back nostalgically to last year. But it means, yes, if it could happen for the time when we were those hosts, why shouldn't it be able to happen for always? The fact that we can actually experience it tells us that this is not just a chimera. It is something that is the figment of somebody's imagination. It is possible for people to be able to live together harmoniously. It is possible. And you have all of these wonderful people who say, but it doesn't make sense that we should be wanting to spend these astronomical amounts on producing instruments of death and destruction when we could use a very small fraction of that, ensuring that everybody had a full life. We know it. But I mean, yeah, it's always going to, I think for a very, very long time, it's always going to be a struggle. But we do get there.